Chapter 14, In the Kuban. My preparations for the projected campaign in the Kuban were all made. On July 29th, the embarkation of the troops was to begin simultaneously in Feodasia and Kerch. At dawn on August 1st, the invading detachment were to disembark near the village of Primorsko-Akhtarskaya, and leaving some troops to cover them on the north, were to advance rapidly on Ekaterinodar. They were to rally the rebels on their way and stir up the Cossacks of the surrounding countryside. This detachment numbered about 4,500 bayonets and sabers, 130 machine guns, 26 big guns, some armored cars, and 8 aeroplanes. A separate detachment of 500 bayonets and a hill battery of 2 guns had been ordered to make a demonstration landing near Anapa and to cooperate with the rebels of this area. Our agents informed us that the Cossacks were everywhere hostile to the Soviet power. We had received the following information concerning the enemy. Their principal forces were in the area lying between Novorossiysk and the Tamana Peninsula. From the north of this peninsula to Yeysk, the coast was guarded only by very small detachments. If the enormous body of rebels be taken into account, our numerical strength was still a little inferior to the enemy's. All the circumstances led us to hope that given secrecy and speed, we would be able to carry out our disembarkation without much opposition. Then afterwards, our troops would advance onto their native soil on which dwelt a sympathetic population, rallying numerous detachments of rebels as they went. Thus they would seize Ekaterinodar, the heart and center of the Kuban, and sweep the Reds of the north right off Kubanian territory before the Red Command had had time to concentrate their very considerable forces. The Kuban once occupied, I intended, as I have already stated, to transfer the whole Don Army Corps to Taman and withdraw our troops to Perekop. Once I had made sure of a base in the Kuban, I intended to begin dealing the Don region. The command of the invading detachment had been given to General Ulagay. Nobody else could have taken it. He had great influence with the Cossacks, and he alone could raise the alarm, stir up the Cossacks, and win them over to his side. Everything, it seemed, would follow from that. Ulagay was an excellent cavalry commander, well able to cope with difficult situations, for he was daring and energetic, and was capable of performing prodigies of valor at the head of his cavalry. I was not ignorant of his weaknesses, however. His lack of organizing ability and his abrupt moods of enthusiasm which would as abruptly veer round to the deepest despondency. I gave General Ulagay and his chief of staff a general outline of the campaign, explained the problem to them, and told them what forces and resources I could spare them. I left it to them to elaborate the details of the operation, such as the distribution of the troops, the division of the different tasks between the units, the organization of the commissariat, etc., whilst I entrusted the general supervisory work to General Chatilov. Later on, I was completely absorbed by political questions and the directing of the troops on the northern front, and so gave very little attention to the execution of the plan. I had delegated to Generals Chatilov, Ulagay, and Dratsenko. This was a great mistake, as the future was not slow in proving. I myself realized it by July 29th when I arrived at Feodasia to witness the embarkation of the troops. General Ulagay's enormous general staff was hampered by its unnecessary size and gave the impression of being an unorganized mob of men selected at random, with no bond of union whatsoever between them. This was inevitably a heavy burden for the troops. The plan for the disembarkation in the Kuban had not been kept secret. The Ataman of the Kuban had heard of it and had informed the members of his government and the Rada. The rumor that we were going to the Kuban was current everywhere behind the lines and even at the front. Nobody seemed to believe the rumors that the general staff spread about to the effect that the disembarkation would take place near Taganrog to support Colonel Nasarov's detachment. An enormous number of Kubanian refugees were trailing along in the wake of the troops. When the embarkation took place, the rabble was indescribable. According to General Kazanovich, some young pupils from the military schools fainted for lack of air. 16,000 men and 4,500 horses were embarked, although the troops numbered only 5,000 bayonets and sabers. All the rest were members of behind-the-line organizations or refugees. It was too late by then to make any changes. I went the round of the ships and spoke to the troops. Then I sent for their leader and gave him full instructions once more. The detachment base is the Kuban, I told him. Do not keep looking back for your ships, and above everything, avoid scattering your troops. Only a brisk advance can bring us success. The slightest delay, and you will be lost. A few days before I had gone to Feodosia, some of our troops had landed there under the leadership of General Bredov. They had retreated to Odessa in Poland during the winter of 1920 and had been interned there. After long months of negotiation, they had been sent to the Crimea by way of Romania. They had been living under the most terrible conditions in Poland. They had been confined to small camps, had lacked suitable clothing, and had been almost without food. After I had inspected the troops which were about to embark, I went to see the newly arrived Bredovians. They were a sorry sight, tattered, barefooted, and some of them dressed only in filthy rags. After they had rested and been re-equipped in Feodosia, these units were to be sent to reinforce the Second Army Corps. During the last days of July, we received many intimations that the Red forces were concentrating on the right bank of the Dnieper. From day to day, we had to be ready for a considerable detachment of Reds should they attempt to force the lower reaches of the Dnieper. The information we had received from our agents and the wireless messages we had intercepted led us to suppose that the principal blow would be struck at the Bereslavl area, opposite Kakhovka, by 3 or 4 divisions. Acting on this information, I gave instructions to Generals Kutupov and Slachchov. On July 25th, the Reds landed near Malaya Kakhovka under cover of artillery fire from the right bank of the Dnieper, which dominates the sandy plain on the left bank. Immediately, they began to construct a pontoon bridge. Simultaneously, another Red detachment crossed the river under cover of the artillery near the Korsunsky Monastery and Alechki. By midday, they had finished the pontoon budge, and towards evening, they occupied Bolchaya Kakhovka with a detachment of 2,000 men and several light batteries. Our units kept the enemy in check stubbornly, but they were decimated by the artillery from the right bank and faced by forces considerably larger than their own, so that they were forced to abandon the counteroffensive. According to the report of the commander of the division which had fought in this area, he had lost not less than half his contingent. He wrote that the fighting power of the troops had been very greatly reduced. On July 26th, the Reds continued their offensive, but this time they met with a repulse. On July 27th, the fighting was still in progress. The enemy completed the passage of the river near Kakhovka and transported their heavy artillery and cavalry units across to the left bank, deploying their forces along a wide front. They then launched an offensive in the south, striving to turn our cavalry's flanks. On July 28th, General Slachchov's Army Corps took up a fortified position from which it could defend the principal route, the Perekop Road. Simultaneously, we managed to concentrate our cavalry so that they might strike a blow at the enemy's left wing. Whilst the cavalry and the units of the Second Army Corps were preparing to strike a blow at the Reds on the left bank of the Dnieper, the situation became threatening on the front, where the First Army Corps was stationed. The Reds had concentrated the 2nd Cavalry Army and the 1st, 3rd, and 46th Divisions of Light Infantry, reinforced with the Communist units and a brigade of pupils from the Red military schools, and were making desperate efforts to break through our front. Time and again, our gallant First Army Corps repulsed the Red attacks, but our losses were enormous, especially amongst the officers. In these circumstances, it became absolutely necessary to finish with the Red group, which had crossed the Dnieper as soon as possible, and thus leave the cavalry free to go to the assistance of the First Army Corps, which was wasting its strength in an unequal fight. At dawn on July 30th, General Barbovich's cavalry units advanced against the enemy's rearguard, which had discovered our cavalry movements and begun to retreat all along the front, pursued by our infantry. General Barbovich overtook a retreating Lettish brigade. Our cavalry rushed upon the enemy, absolutely defeated them, and took 2,000 prisoners and 3 guns, complete with ammunition wagons. But in spite of gallant General Barbovich's profitable venture, which had inflicted this severe defeat on the enemy, General Slokchov could not win a decisive success. He had scattered the units of his army corps, and so could not make use of any of our cavalry's success. Indeed, he gave the enemy time to recover themselves. In the meantime, the First Army Corps continued to repulse the fierce attacks of the Reds, shedding nearly every drop of their blood in the effort. The fighting, which continued throughout the day of July 31st, ended in a fresh failure. Our unit suffered heavy losses. The enemy put up a stubborn opposition. The Lets fought especially tenaciously. The enemy worked relentlessly to reinforce their position. At last, on the First Army Corps' front, they seemed to be losing their breath. Their attacks grew visibly weaker. From the morning of August 1st, a calm began to settle over the greater part of the front. General Kutupov was optimistic about the future. In the evening, a telegram came to say that our troops had succeeded in landing near the hamlet of Akhtarsky. Although a rumor of the raid on the Kuban had most certainly leaked through to the enemy, owing to the indiscretion of the Kubanians in charge, the Red Command were ignorant of the exact landing place, and the raid had been accomplished without any losses. On the evening of August 2nd, General Slokchov telegraphed that he would be forced to give up his attacks on the enemy's fortified position. The head of the Kakhovka Bridge was in the hands of the enemy, and this put a considerable number of our troops out of action, besides constituting a menace to our left flank on our most important route, the Perekop Road. Nevertheless, the enemy had not been able to win a decisive victory. Northern Taurida remained in our hands, and the units which had been detached from our main army had earned out the first part of their task. They had landed and marched rapidly on to Kubanian territory. In view of the development in the operations at the Kuban, I decided to transfer my headquarters to Sebastopol and to amalgamate the commands of the 1st and 2nd Army Corps, putting them both into the hands of General Kutupov. Kutupov could cope with any situation. He was a man of great military prowess and exceptional tenacity in the pursuit of his ends. He had won the friendship of officers and men alike, and was an incomparable instructor for the troops. On August 10th, M. Millerand, in a letter to Ems, easily counselor at our embassy in Paris, declared his de facto recognition of the South Russian government. Paris, August 10, 1920. To the Chargé d'Affaires. Sire, in a letter of August 8th, you asked me if I did not consider it opportune to give effect to the statements I made to you on the subject of the de facto recognition of the South Russian government. You asked me to take into consideration, on the one hand, the consolidation of the internal government and General Wrangel's military successes, and on the other, the assurances contained in your letter of August 3rd. You also point out the advantage of our having a diplomatic agent at Sebastopol who will be able to exercise effective moral influence at least by reason of his personal authority. I have the honor to inform you that the government of the Republic has decided to accord de facto recognition to the government of South Russia and will send a diplomatic agent to Sebastopol, as you suggest, at the same time notifying the allied and associated governments of its decision. I must add that I think it advantageous that this decision should receive as much publicity as possible. Yours faithfully, Millerand. To M. Baisley, Roussillon Chargé d'Affaires. On August 3rd, I had telegraphed to the President of the French Council, His Excellency M. Millerand, President of the Council of Foreign Affairs, Paris. In view of the Republican government's decision to recognize the South Russian government, I beg to offer you my warmest thanks for the invaluable help you have given the national cause of Russia at a supremely trying moment. We are straining every effort to accomplish our preordained task of re-establishing a Russia based on the great principles of liberty and progress. General Wrangel. A few days later, the American government's note setting forth the views of the United States on the Russian and Polish questions came to our notice. Grace communicated it to us in several telegrams. The American government has published a note elucidating its point of view on the Russian and Polish questions. Polish territory is not to be touched. America is sympathetic towards the powers' negotiations for an armistice between Poland and the Soviets, but opposes the convocation of a general conference which would probably finish by recognizing the Bolshevists and the partition of Russia. America has pronounced in favor of the unity of Russia and wants the settlement of all questions relating to the sovereignty of the territories of the old Russian Empire to be postponed. Therefore, she has already refused to recognize the independence of the states which have been set up on the frontier, with the one exception of Armenia. She states that the frontiers of Armenia were definitely fixed with the cooperation and consent of Russia. The same cooperation is necessary to deal with the Near Eastern question. The United States will recognize neither the Soviet government, which is the very negation of all international law, nor the principles of any of those nations which are striving for world revolution by means of the Third International. The American note has been very well received here. It releases France from her painful position of political isolation and gives her solid moral support in her anti-Bolshevist policy, which is crippling Lloyd George's stubborn desire to come to an understanding with the Soviets. The cabinet here in Paris has taken advantage of America's note to declare openly, in a note published today, its complete agreement with the democratic and national principles which America has voiced in the Russian note. It was the adoption of these principles by the South Russian government that led France to accord it recognition. The essential point for us to notice in America's action is the fact that the United States are upholding the principle of the territorial integrity of Russia. I instructed M. Struve to see that our ambassador at Washington conveyed to the American government our sincere gratitude for the support it had given us by its declaration. The situation on the Polish front seemed hopeless. The Red Army had continued its advance and was now approaching Warsaw. The front was within 50 kilometers of the capital, which was being evacuated with all speed. Simultaneously, under the stimulus of patriotism, a huge number of volunteers from all classes of the population were joining the army. General Weygand, who had just reached Poland, was doing his utmost to reorganize the Polish army with the help of the French staff officers he had brought with him. The army was being regrouped with the object of launching an offensive at the first possible moment and of wresting the initiative from the enemy. The Kuban operation was progressing favorably. General Ulagai's units had absolutely defeated the Red Caucasian Cavalry Division and had taken many prisoners, including the divisional staff and its commander, Comrade Meyer, and all the artillery. Then they had effected their junction with Colonel Scotton's rebels. 2,000 Cossacks from the freed villages had joined our troops. The favorable military situation, our latest success in the field of foreign relations, and the gradual establishment of normal order in the country all strengthened the people's confidence in us as the new rulers. Things began to settle down. The economic situation alone showed no signs of improvement. The maintenance of the army, which was very large in proportion to the size of the territory it occupied, under conditions of economic disorder, which were inevitable during a civil war, was a heavy burden on the country. Our ordinary expenses were more than covered by direct and indirect taxation, but our military expenses, since it was impossible to obtain a loan at home or abroad, swallowed up the last remnants of our fund of foreign securities. In case the operations which were in progress in the Kuban should make the northern section of our front an independent theater of war, I decided to amalgamate the troops of the 1st and 2nd Army Corps and the Cavalry Corps and call them the 1st Army, putting General Kutupov at their head. I gave the command of the 1st Army Corps to General Pisarev and put General Vitkovsky at the head of the 2nd Army Corps instead of General Slakchov. General Slakchov, who had long been a slave to drink and drugs, had now become completely unhinged as a result. On August 5th, he arrived in Sebastopol. He was a terrible spectacle. His face was deadly pale, and his mouth never ceased to tremble, while tears streamed from his eyes. He sent me a dispatch which was abundant proof that that I was dealing with a man in the throes of mental sickness. I had difficulty in calming him. I was as friendly as I could be and tried to persuade him how necessary it was that he should take care of himself. I assured him that once he had taken a rest and was better, he would again be able to serve our cause. I promised to do all I could to prevent his departure from being interpreted as a dismissal. General Slachchov seemed touched beyond words. He thanked me in a trembling voice, broken by tears. I could not look at him without feeling the deepest pity. That same day, he and his wife paid a visit to my wife. The next day, we returned their visit. Slachchov was living at the station in a railway carriage. Incredible disorder reigned in his compartment. The table was covered with bottles and dishes of hors d'oeuvres. On the bunks were clothes, playing cards, and weapons, all lying about anyhow. Amidst all this confusion was Slachchov, clad in a fantastic white dolman, gold-laced and befurred. He was surrounded by all kinds of birds. He had a crane there, and also a raven, a swallow, and a jay. They were hopping about on the table and the bunks, fluttering round and perching on their master's head and shoulders. I insisted on General Slachchov undergoing a medical examination. The doctors diagnosed an acute form of neurasthenia, which necessitated strict treatment obtainable only in a sanatorium. They advised Slachchov to go abroad and take care of himself, but all attempts to persuade him to go away were in vain. He decided to settle down in Yalta. The regrouping of the Polish forces had been completed, and waves of obstinate fighting rolled up to the very walls of Warsaw. On some sections of the front, the Poles were victorious, the Bolshevists beaten. On General Kutupov's front, fierce fighting had begun again on August 5th. In the meantime, on August 5th, our units in the Kuban had occupied several villages on the Ekaterinodar road, but had gone no farther. The latest news of the enemy we had received mentioned a concentration of Red forces. New units were making their appearance on General Ulagay's front. It was obvious that the enemy had begun to collect their forces to attack our invading detachment. There was no time to be lost. Every day we wasted gave the enemy another day in which to bring up fresh troops. Yet General Ulagay did not stir on August 6th, 7th, or 8th. General Siegel, chief of the fortified area at Kerch, reported that our scouts in the Taman Peninsula had sent word that the enemy were retreating. He had ordered a detachment, hastily formed from the reserve units and those behind the lines at Kerch, to land in Taman. On the morning of the 10th, I left for Kerch. The unforgivable delay in the movements of General Ulagay's units was alarming me, and my brain was racked with anxious thoughts. At Vladislavovka station, General Chatov got into my compartment. His gloomy expression warned me immediately that he was bringing bad news. Silently, he handed me a telegram from General Ulagay. It said that the situation had become serious, for fresh enemy units had come up, and the enemy now enjoyed an overwhelming numerical superiority. Therefore, he begged that ships might be sent as soon as possible to the hamlet of Akhtarsky to pick up the expeditionary force. My presentiment had not been a false one. The short sentences of the radiogram did not give a complete picture of what had happened, but it was obvious that every operation we had undertaken had failed. The indispensable condition of success, unexpectedness, was already lost. The initiative had been allowed to fall from our hands, and the chief of the detachment had lost all faith in the possibility of success. Yet, at the same time, the enemy's retreat from the Taman Peninsula still gave us a little hope that all was not lost. If General Ulagay could manage to defeat the forces which were coming up against him from Taman, and if he could transfer his base to the Tamanan Peninsula, our position would still be fairly good. Unfortunately, we lacked the necessary troops for keeping our hold on the peninsula until General Ulagay's troops should arrive. General Siegel had succeeded in getting together a mixed company and about 100 plastons with just one gun at Kerch. But these troops were deficient alike in quantity and quality and did not constitute a real force. The intensive fighting which was still in progress on the northern front did not permit of the transfer of a single man from there. On the morning of August 11th, I went to the village of Tamanskaya, where I was present at the singing of the Te Deum. I also addressed a public meeting. The village was almost empty. The few Cossacks who remained were in a state of absolute terror. They had no faith in our success and expected the Reds to come back at any moment. Our units were already 10 versts to the east of the village, and the enemy were retreating without putting up any resistance. On my return to Kerch, I found a wireless message from General Babiev, the gallant commander of the 1st Kuban Cossack Division. He reported that he had just won a fairly big success near the villages of Brinkovskaya and Olginskaya. He knew about the telegram which General Ulagai had sent me the previous evening, but all the same, he thought that our position was now a favorable one, and he saw no reason why we should give up the operation which we had begun. His lines of communication with General Ulagai had been cut. That was why he had sent this report straight to me. I sent General Babiev's telegram on to General Ulagai by aeroplane, adding a word of my own to the effect that I considered it necessary to go on with the operation, at the same time bearing in mind the possibility of transferring our base to Taman. I asked him for a detailed communique on the situation. On the morning of the 12th, I received another telegram from General Ulagai. The situation had changed slightly, and it was no longer necessary to send the ships. The telegram reassured me only very slightly. The commander's abrupt change of arrangements was clear proof that he had lost his head altogether. That evening, the airmen returned with the detailed report on the situation for which I had asked. In spite of the words he himself had addressed to the commanders of the units, only an energetic offensive can bring us success. The Kuban is our base. We have burnt our boats. General Ulagai unfortunately encumbered himself with enormous rearguard impedimenta. Great reserves of arms, ammunition, and provisions had been left at the landing stage near the village of Primorsko-Akhtarsky. The refugees and the soldiers, families who had followed the army to the Kuban, had also remained there. Thus, even whilst they advanced, our units were compelled to look back all the time. We received information that the Reds were concentrating their forces. General Ulagai feared for his base and began to vacillate. General Babiev and others urged an immediate march on Ekaterinodar, for according to some fugitives, it was almost empty of Red troops, who had left in a panic. But Ulagai would not come to any decision on August 6th or 7th. On the night of the 10th, General Ulagai gave the order to retreat and simultaneously sent a telegram asking that the ships should be sent after all. Meanwhile, on August 9th, General Babiev had struck a heavy blow at the enemy and taken 1,000 prisoners and many machine guns. On the Lalith and 11th, the Reds attacked our expeditionary force, but met with no success. Our units had followed up their advance in Taman. I had sent them the detachment which had landed at Anapa in the south at the same time as General Ulagai's troops. It had been attempting to win over the Greens who were operating in this area. The hopes that we had entertained of the Greens had not been fulfilled. The new detachment had been attacked by the Reds and driven down to the sea, where they were holding out only with the greatest difficulty. In spite of their heavy losses, the pupils of the military schools who composed it had cut a brave figure. On August 13th, we were still occupying several villages in Taman, but our advance began to meet with an ever more vigorous resistance. The enemy had driven back General Ulagai's units and so released some troops from the Taman area. These were now hastening to re-establish their position on this front. On the Polish front, the situation had changed radically. The Polish troops had passed to the offensive and inflicted a crushing defeat on the Reds. In the area between Narev and the German frontier, many tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers had laid down their arms, whilst tens of thousands more had crossed the German frontier and been disarmed. The Bolshevist armies were in retreat all along the front, and the Poles were pursuing them. Every day, the Polish victory took on greater and even greater dimensions. The strategic situation changed with kaleidoscopic rapidity. On August 9th, 22nd, M. Maklikov telegraphed, "I have spoken to a paleolog. The Bolshevist attack having been crushed, Poland is about to conclude the peace. The great powers are to fix the frontiers on ethnographical lines. Paleolog realizes how necessary it is that you should have speedy help. Everything possible will be done." The signature of peace by Poland would make our position infinitely more serious. The failure of the Kuban operation had robbed us of our last hope of finding a way of continuing the struggle on neighboring Russian territory. Abandoned to our fate as we now were, we would inevitably perish sooner or later. But I did not give up all hope that France, who had just recognized us and had therefore taken up a very pronounced attitude towards the Soviet power, would not leave us helpless. Maklakov's telegram strengthened my hope. Since it was apparent that France might waver, we had to maintain her belief in the strength of our position. The news of the forced abandonment of the Kuban would have produced a particularly unfavorable impression abroad at such a moment, therefore it had to be hushed up. I instructed M. Struve to send the chief of the French mission a memorandum with the necessary explanations. At the same time, Neratov telegraphed to Maklakov. By order of the Commander-in-Chief, Struve has sent the chief of the French military mission the following memorandum. General Wrangel wishes to submit to the French government and High Command the following observations on the general military situation. Poland's great success in her fight against the Red Army makes it possible, for the first time in the course of this war, to strike a decisive blow at the Soviet power by means of concerted action by the Polish and Russian armies under the supreme direction of the French High Command. This would ensure the general tranquility and social peace of the whole world. The conclusion of a separate peace between the Poles and the Bolshevists will leave the question still open and will not wipe out the Bolshevist danger. These considerations have led the Commander-in-Chief to put before the French government and High Command the problem of the establishment of one anti-Bolshevist front in cooperation with the Poles and under the general direction of the French High Command. In such an eventuality, our strategical plans will have to undergo some modification, and the center of operations will have to be shifted to the Ukraine. The Commander-in-Chief does not consider it advisable to modify his strategical plans until he is sure of the approval and cooperation of the French government. But the situation at the front demands a rapid decision and its immediate execution. In General Ulaguet's army, in addition to the effectives who are more or less adequately armed and equipped, there are nearly 5,000 soldiers who lack the great essential rifles. Under such conditions as these, the Commander-in-Chief has to carry out a complex and difficult strategical operation. The Commander-in-Chief's suggestions for a modification of his strategical plan are as follows. If the Poles follow up the operations on their right wing, we must not push on towards the right. This would be to repeat the mistake which General Denikin made when he did not effect a junction with Admiral Kolchak's troops. The Bolshevists have concentrated considerable forces in the Kuban, therefore we must send reinforcements there. But this is only possible if we evacuate the mainland of Taurida, although the general situation demands that we remain in occupation there. Should the Poles begin active operations on their right wing in the Ukraine, whilst we concentrate our efforts on our left wing, a continuous common front will result, and we will aim at destroying the Soviet power once and for all, and restoring tranquility to Europe on the basis of a general peace. The Commander-in-Chief urgently requests a speedy answer. Will you arrange all the necessary measures with the French government and High Command and telegraph the result to us? On August 15th, General Babiev's units once again attempted an offensive, but were unsuccessful. Already, the enemy possessed an enormous numerical superiority. After heavy fighting, which lasted throughout the day, General Ulaguet ordered the troops to withdraw to Achuyev. When I heard the news, I ordered ships to proceed to Achuyev to take the invading detachment on board. General Chadalov went over there on a torpedo boat. On August 17th, our units began to embark near Achuyev. The lay of the land made it possible for us to hold the enemy in check with a very small rearguard and to embark in absolute security. The troops came on board in perfect order. In spite of heavy losses, our effectives had increased considerably in numbers. For example, one of our divisions, which had lost 300 men and 200 horses, had left Feodasia with 1,200 men and 250 horses, It came back with 1,500 Cossacks and 600 horses. All those who could were fleeing from the Red Yoke. Towards evening, General Chatilov came back and reported that the embarkation was going on quite normally, that General Babiev's cavalry was already on board, and that the rest of the troops were not far behind. Meanwhile, the situation on the northern front had become threatening. From the 9th to the 11th, fierce and bloody fighting had been going on. The enemy attacked us without truce or intermission and drove back the 1st Army Corps in several places. The Red Cavalry came right down into our territory and threatened our railway communications. The 2nd Army Corps had been driven back to Perekop. On the morning of the 17th, the struggle was resumed with great fierceness all along the front. Until midday, the issue was uncertain. General Kutupov thought that the situation was very serious. I decided to go to Melitopol. At Jankoy Station, we were warned that the Red Cavalry patrols were approaching the railway. The signal lights were put out, and our train went northwards in the twilight. I reached Melitopol late in the evening. In spite of the lateness of the hour, the streets near staff headquarters were crowded with people. Agony was limned on those gloomy, anxious faces. General Kutupov had not lost his coolness. Towards night, reports came in from most of the areas under fire. Although the day had ended in some success for us, the situation was still grave. The presence of the Red Cavalry in our rear boded all kinds of unexpected results. On August 18th, the enemy again attacked and were everywhere repulsed. On the 19th, our troops in their turn launched an offensive. The crisis was over, and I could return to Kerch. The news of our success spread rapidly through the town of Melitopol. The streets were full of life, and joyful faces were to be seen everywhere. An enormous crowd greeted me with loud cheers. On the 19th, I reached Kerch. The embarkation at Achuyev was progressing favorably. At Taman, our troops had suffered a slight repulse. The chief of the detachment there reported that he had suffered heavy losses and must retreat. Towards night, this detachment reached the shore. I ordered it to be taken on board and back to Kerch. The expedition to the Kuban ended in failure. We were driven down onto a little strip of Russian territory on the coast, and from there we had to continue the struggle against an enemy who commanded all the vast stretches of Russia. Our forces dwindled day by day. Our resources were used up. The dead weight of failure was crushing my heart. Again and again I asked myself if it had not been my fault. Had I foreseen everything? Had all my calculations been accurate? The heavy fighting on the northern front, where the Red Menace had been checked only at the cost of enormous efforts, made it impossible to transfer any troops from this area to the seat of the Kuban operation. The direction mapped out for the raiding company had been well chosen. In spite of the indiscretions of the Kubanians in authority, whose idle gossip had threatened the secrecy of the operation, the exact landing place had remained unknown to the enemy. The Reds had expected us at Taman and in the Novorossiysk section. The troops had landed without loss, and 3 days later had taken the most important railway in Kuban, Timashevskaya Station, thus coming within 40 versts of Ekaterinodar, the heart of the Kuban. If General Ulugay had not hesitated, but had marched straight on without a backward glance at his base, Ekaterinodar would have been taken in 2 days, and the northern Kuban would have been free. There is no gainsaying this. Yet, at the same time, a great deal of what had happened had been my fault. I knew General Ulugay's strong points and his weaknesses. When I appointed General Dratsenko, whom I did not know, to the post of Chief of Staff, I should have arranged all the details of the plan and the preparations for the operation myself. I had, however, entrusted the task to General Chatilov, who was also very busy, and therefore had been able to devote but little time to it. I blamed myself bitterly and could find no excuses for myself. The only positive result of the expedition was the large number of reinforcements, both men and horses, which we had added to our expeditionary force. It now numbered about 10,000 Cossacks. This not only compensated for the heavy losses we had suffered on the northern front, but even left us a large surplus. The collapse of the Red troops on the Polish front became more and more definite. More than 100,000 prisoners fell into the hands of the Poles, whilst about the same number of men had been interned in Germany. At the same time, the probability of peace between Poland and Soviet Russia became greater and greater. Poland was said to have declared explicitly that Poland sincerely wants peace. Riga had already been mentioned as the seat of future negotiations. I left General Chatalov at Kerch and set out for Sebastopol on the night of August 20th. As soon as I arrived, I took what steps I could to prevent our recent failure in the Kuban creating an unfavorable impression. The day after my arrival, Admiral McCully, the chief of the American military mission, paid me a visit. By order of his government, he submitted a series of written questions to me on the subject of the general policy of the South Russian government. Office of the Special Agent of the United States State, Department for Russia, Sebastopol, Russia, September 6, 1920. Your Excellency, for the information of the U.S. government, I would appreciate very much a fairly explicit and comprehensive statement by General Wrangel of his policy and aims. The following questions suggest the character of the information desired. 1. Is the policy of General Wrangel the restoration of Russia on the basis of a general expression of the will of the people, and is he pledged to the creation of a constituent assembly to be elected by the will of the people on the basis of general and direct national suffrage? 2. Does General Wrangel specifically disavow any intention to impose upon Russia any unrepresentative government, ignoring the sanctions of popular assent and acceptance? 3. Is the interpretation of recent declarations of General Wrangel correct, that, recognizing the mistakes of the Denikin and Kolchak governments and profiting by their experience, he does not regard the establishment of law and freedom in Russia as primarily a military task, that he places first and foremost the organization of production and satisfaction of needs of the peasants, who constitute the great majority of the Russian people, that General Wrangel is organizing and training an organization not for pursuing extensive war against Bolshevism along the type attempted by Kolchak and Denikin, but would agree to protect against attack the nucleus of national regeneration. That, in short, his attempt is to create a center of political and economic order and consolidated effort around which Russian groups and territories may gather freely and develop their own desired effect. 4. Information exists that General Wrangel is introducing behind-the-lines local self-government by means of popularly elected zemstvos and other democratic agencies, and that in particular, he is seeking to solve the land problem in an orderly manner by constitutional methods and by validating the ownership of the lands by the peasants. Is this information correct? 5. Are there not a considerable number of refugees now dependent on General Wrangel's protection against the Bolshevists? Approximately how many such refugees are there, and to what classes and groups do they in general belong? 6. Would it be justifiable to conclude that General Wrangel, although believing his movement to be the present center of Russia's efforts at self-restoration and recovery of unity and national lie, does not, at the moment, profess or claim to be the head of an all-Russian government, that he does not regard himself as authorized to make treaties intending to be binding upon any future Russian government that may be set up, or to grant concessions or otherwise dispose of the national domains and resources? 7. Is the recent declaration of the policy of the U.S. government satisfactory to General Wrangel, both as regards Poland and as regards the unity and integrity of Russia? 8. What are the safeguards which General Wrangel feels can be relied upon, and which may assure other nations that General Wrangel will be able to pursue the policy of building up the portion of Russia which comes under his jurisdiction without permitting its development into either a military adventure or a political reaction? As definite and explicit a statement of his aims as General Wrangel may be good enough to make would be much appreciated. N.A. McCully, Rear Admiral, USN. To His Excellency M. Peter Struve, Minister of Foreign Affairs, South Russian Government. The Admiral, a sincere friend of our cause, was simply beaming when he delivered this questionnaire to me. He believed that the American government's request for answers to its questions was a preliminary to America's recognition of the South Russian government. On August 24th, the following answer to the questions was sent to Admiral McCully. Confidential. One General Wrangel has declared many times that his sole aim is to enable the Russian people to express their wishes freely on the subject of the future government of the country. Today, therefore, he can but affirm once again his intention of establishing conditions which will permit of the calling of a national assembly based on universal suffrage, through which the Russian people can decide on the form of government for New Russia. 2. General Wrangel has not the slightest intention of imposing a government on Russia, which would function without the cooperation of a national representative body or the sympathy and support of the people. 3. The interpretation of General Wrangel's recent declarations in the sense that he does not regard the establishment of law and liberty in Russia as preeminently a military task is perfectly justified. On the contrary, the series of reforms which have already been carried out prove that General Wrangel attaches primary importance to reconstructive work in the state and to the satisfying of the needs of the peasants who constitute the great majority of the Russian people. It is precisely because he wants to foster the peaceful development of creative governmental action that General Wrangel has refrained from bringing to the fore the question of the enlargement of the front on which his armies are fighting the Bolshevists. He has rather tried to assure the integrity of the economic and political center, which has been created by the Russian army on occupied territory and in the Cossack regions with which he is in close alliance. The preservation of this healthy nucleus is indispensable, for it has to serve as a center of gravity for the free development of the final efforts of the Russian people for national regeneration. 4. The information concerning the reforms which General Wrangel's government has carried out by creating district zemstvos and in agrarian spheres is absolutely accurate. The first of these reforms anticipates decentralization and safeguards the local economic interests of the population who will deal with economic questions through their freely elected agencies. The law concerning the district zemstvos will be followed at a very early date by one concerning the provincial zemstvos. Both laws are to serve as a basis for a representative organ of a more general character. The land reform will deal with the agrarian problem in a radical way by allowing the legal remission by redemption of arable land to its cultivators who will become its owners. Thus, a strong class of small peasant proprietors will be created in accordance with the ideal of the Russian peasant. 5. The number of refugees who have sought General Wrangel's protection against the Bolshevists is very high. It greatly exceeds 500,000 in the Crimea alone, and there are almost as many again scattered through the Near East, Egypt, and Europe. Most of them are old men, women, and children. All these refugees are benefiting in one way or another from the support and help of the South Russian government. Should the integrity of the territories of the South Russian government be guaranteed, General Wrangel thinks it is his duty to facilitate the return of these refugees to their country and to allow them to devote themselves to productive work. This body of refugees is made up of the most diverse elements. They belong to all classes of the population, for men of all classes found it equally impossible to endure the Bolshevist tyranny. 6. General Wrangel considers that the government of which he is the head is the sole remaining depository of the idea of national regeneration and the restoration of Russian unity. He thinks, however, that only a government set up after the National Assembly has settled its nature should have the power to conclude treaties affecting the sovereign rights of the Russian people or of disposing of the national patrimony. 7. The declaration of policy which was made recently by the government of the United States coincides in every respect with General Wrangel's political program. He is in complete agreement with the clauses dealing with the preservation of Russian unity and territorial integrity, as well as with those dealing with Poland. General Wrangel would like to take this occasion to express his very deepest gratitude to the federal government. 8. General Wrangel realizes that if foreign powers accord recognition to the work already performed by his government, they would like to be assured in some way, other than by a verbal declaration, that their fear that the South Russian government's activities may degenerate into a military adventure or a political reaction is quite unjustified. As regards their fear of a military adventure, General Wrangel begs to remind you that he is ready to end the civil war as soon as the integrity of the territory under his authority and the Cossack regions is guaranteed effectively, and as soon as the Russian people, now ground down beneath the Bolshevist yoke, are given the means of expressing their will freely. General Wrangel declares, on his side, that he is ready to promise the population of the territory which accepts his authority that they will be able to express their opinions. He is firmly convinced that this population will never pronounce in favor of the Soviets. As for his personal affairs, General Wrangel has already declared openly that his object is to enable the people to express their wishes freely. He then will submit to the sovereign voice of the Russian nation without the slightest hesitation. Sebastopol, August 24, September 6, 1920. Heavy fighting was still in progress on our northern front. Our troops were pushing back the enemy towards Kakhovka and drawing near to one of the fortified positions. During the night of August 21st, the units of the 2nd Army Corps attacked the enemy, but were received by furious counterattacks and barrage fire from the artillery. Our infantry attacked the fortified position with tanks and armored cars, and made a sudden incursion into the first line of the enemy's fortifications. In spite of heavy losses, our units hurled themselves against the second line of trenches, which was defended by a large number of machine guns. The Reds replied with a counterattack in front, at the same time enveloping both our wings. 2 of our 4 tanks were destroyed by artillery fire. Before dawn, our units were forced to return to their starting place, for the enemy's fire had grown more and more deadly. At 7 o'clock in the morning, all the units of our attacking force were ordered to occupy the most advantageous positions possible and limit themselves to an active defense. Our second failure before Kakhovka demonstrated the strength of this position, the tenacity of the Reds in defending it, and the breakup of our infantry's dashing offensive. To fill in the gaps made during the recent engagements, I ordered a fresh mobilization and a requisition of 1,500 horses. These repeated mobilizations and requisitioning of horses weighed heavily on the people, yet all through our struggle, they manifested sincere sympathy towards us. But the recent military burdens had become insupportable, and cases of failure to mobilize became more and more frequent. Although I fully realized the insupportable weight of the sacrifices I asked of the population, I was nevertheless compelled to enforce the impositions by every means in my power. The implacable struggle demanded sacrifices from everybody. The enemy took advantage of the difficulty of the situation in our rear and did their utmost to increase their propaganda behind the lines. Towards the middle of July, the Bolshevists succeeded in getting into touch with the Crimean Committee of the Communist Party by way of the sea. This organization had been dispersed for a time, but had renewed its activities towards the end of June. Motorboats from Anapa and Novorossiysk kept up communications with the Bolshevists outside the Crimea. On August 5th, a communist detachment of about a dozen men under the leadership of the sailor Mokrohusov landed on the coast, having run their motorboat close in to the shore. The detachment was armed with machine guns, cartridges, hand grenades, and a large sum of money, 500 million rubles in notes called Romanovs. At this time, a Romanov ruble was worth 70 rubles in our currency, as well as 200,000 pounds in Turkish money. Mokrohusov, with the aid of his confederates, succeeded in reaching the forests. He assumed the resounding title of Commander of the Army of the Insurgents in the Crimea, and began to recruit every kind of rolling stone into his ranks. Towards the end of August, Mokrohusov had collected about 300 men, whom he divided into 3 regiments. These bands behaved very daringly. During the night of July 30th, a detachment of Greens had attacked a convoy of artillery, taken away the horses, and blown up the ammunition. On August 4th, they had robbed the forest home of Massandra of 1,000,000 rubles. During the night of August 20th, they attacked the Bachui mines, robbed the strong box, burnt down the explosives depot, and destroyed the shafts. On August 22nd, Mokrahusov's bands invaded Kuchuk-Auzen and carried off the sergeant of the police and 11 policemen. On the 29th, a band of 150 men had attacked the market town of Sudak with 4 machine guns, but the convalescent officers and soldiers there had been warned in time and repulsed them, incurring heavy losses. The regional Revcom II, which had large sums of money at its disposal, was also working in the towns. In 4 months, the Revcom had received from Moscow, through the Jewish courier Raphael Kurgan, surnamed Folia, 1,000,000 Romanovs in notes, 10,000 pounds sterling, and gold and diamonds worth 40 million rubles. Communist committees had been formed at Simferopol, Sebastopol, Yalta, Feodosia, Kerch, and Upatona, and all were well provided with money. They all kept in communication with one another by means of a brisk service of couriers. On August 2nd, a communist center was discovered in Yalta. It was found to possess printing machinery and had been maintaining communications with the regional committee. During August, 2 of the regional committee's couriers were arrested in the war zone. They were engaged in espionage. Almost simultaneously, the Soviet spy courier Simka Kessel was arrested at Perekop. He had wormed his way from the Crimea to Odessa. A little later, we managed to collect enough information to enable us to watch the people who were at the very center of the new regional communist committee. The watch we kept resulted in the arrest on August 21st of a certain Morduk Akodise, who was trying to get through the forest to Sebastopol. He had received orders from the regional committee to re-establish the Revolutionary Committee in Sebastopol, for which work he had received 16,000 Romanov rubles, which were found on him. At the same time, the Jews Raphael Kurgan, Folia, and Naum Glatman were arrested in Simferopol, where they had been living under assumed names. They were the local representatives of the regional committee. In their rooms were found 250,000 Romanov rubles in bundles enclosed in wrappers bearing the stamp of the People's Bank of Moscow, 1,000,000 of the Supreme Command's rubles, and gold and diamond objects officially valued at 28 million rubles. There was also some party correspondence, financiers' accounts, and notes on the political work of the Crimean Regional Committee. On the same day, the Jews Hirsch Gottsman and Osman Gillard were arrested. In Gottsman's house were found letters and the stamp of the Sebastopol Revolutionary Committee, which had hardly been used. In Gillard's rooms, letters were also found, as well as 3 million rubles in every currency of the world, which was the property of the party. The material collected by raids on the houses of the aforementioned men and the absolutely sincere and detailed confessions they made enabled us to root out the whole network of the Bolshevist organization which had spread over the Crimea. The number of people formally subjected to the preliminary inquiry in the course of the month exceeded 150. The organization of our enemy's agents in the Crimea had been dealt a shattering blow. I was indebted to General Klimovich for the rapidity of the searches and the destruction of the communist network in the district. The whole police force of the state, which was doing its duty very well and successfully, was under his authority. The elections to the district Zemstvos were completed in an astonishing short space of time. There were already 68 agrarian district Soviets. Almost everywhere inquiries into the land reserves had been completed and lists of people with a right to a plot of land in full ownership made up. Many of the agrarian Soviets had already arranged their scale for the distribution of landed property. Proprietors by right of the new law were already in existence. In the Melitopol and Dniprovsk districts, the district agrarian Soviets had already begun to portion out several large estates. The externals of life behind the lines no longer bore witness to the recent days of anguish. In spite of its proximity to the front, the negligence and debauchery so usual in towns behind the lines were conspicuous by their absence. The great number of officers behind the front had fallen back into disciplined ways. Life went on quietly as usual.